In the meantime, of course, the left has cooked up a bunch of new fake scandals. One of them involves Congressman Byron Donalds, who apparently said at he was at an event in Philadelphia, a Black Republican outreach event in Philadelphia, and he was talking about the state of Black Americans throughout history, including during the Jim Crow era. And this is not like some sort of fiction. Black families were more whole during the Jim Crow era, despite all of the things being thrown at Black Americans at the time. Black families were more together. That's just true. There were more fathers and mothers together with children during that era. And after that, there has been a very big devastation of the Black family over time, much of it directly at the hands of the government, which has just been awful. And so Byron Donalds was talking about this reality, and the left has distorted it into something unrecognizable. Even Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat leader, took to the floor of the House to condemn Byron Donalds, and he said this.
It's come to my attention that a so-called leader has made the factually inaccurate statement that Black folks were better off during Jim Crow. That's an outlandish, outrageous, and out-of-pocket observation.
He didn't even say that, though. You're attacking him for something he didn't say. Meanwhile, Joy Reid over on MSNBC, or was this on The View that this occurred? It was MSNBC? So Joy Reid over on MSNBC asked Byron Donalds about all of this, and here's how he responded.
If a Black man, a Black father, could not protect his wife, his son, or himself from lynching and violence, how is him being in the home mean that that is an era that was better for the Black family, or that we should think of as a good thing?
First of all, Joy, I never said that it was better for Black people in Jim Crow. I have never said that, and even my own words say that. If you're talking about the importance of Black fathers in the home, or frankly, all fathers in the home, it is always for the betterment of children, to have leadership, yes, for safety. So having two people in the home to help provide the economic needs for those children.
This is common sense, but the left, of course, has distorted it beyond recognition. Delano Squires joins us now. He's a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he's on the phone. Hello, sir. Good to have you back with us.
Thanks for having me.
This is one of those bizarro world news cycles that we've become accustomed to, where you get a Republican who says something, the left pretends he said something completely different, and then attacks the thing he didn't say.
I mean, we've seen this. There's a precedent for this. We saw this with the fake, quote-unquote, "Don't Say Gay" bill in Florida, and how, a bill promoting parental rights in education, which eventually became law, was spun as something that was, against the LGBTQ community, so to speak. And then we saw the same thing happen again in Florida with what I dubbed the "Don't Say Slave" fake controversy, where two lines in a curriculum that the governor did not write that had to do with slavery were spun out to, and people were saying, well, Governor DeSantis says that slavery was good for Black people, and it was basically a nice jobs program for the Black community. And I think we're back with the same thing, where Byron Donalds says during Jim Crow, the Black family was together. And that was spun as, oh, he thinks Jim Crow was good for Black families. And the frustration part of it, honestly, is that the left has no problem invoking Jim Crow, but only when the purpose is to scare Black voters in 2024 into thinking that they're only one step from going back to 1944. But when a Republican mentions Jim Crow and highlights the resilience of Black families during that time,
yes,
then they say, well, we can't have that. And I think we're seeing this in this, this ginned up fake controversy.
Of course. And one of the many ironies baked into this is that you have a Black Republican talking about the horrors of Jim Crow and Black Americans prevailing in the face of that. And the left nowadays saying, oh, we're against Jim Crow. The left, they own the legacy of Jim Crow. Like the party, even so far as you're going to talk about the history of this, it was the Democrats who advanced all of this. And yet we are in this, it's a constant attempt to manipulate what people are hearing to distort it beyond recognition.
Yeah, and it's funny. I've seen this happen so often on social media, and in fact, I've seen it happen to me that I've come up with a way to sort of shed some light to it. What I say is that a lot of people have, and you see this with Joy Reid and other people who are putting words in Byron Donalds' mouth that he never said.
Yeah,
I say that they have degrees from Cleo Keller University. So if you remember Miss Cleo,
yes,
she claimed to be, a medium, that she could read people's minds.
That's right. Call me now for your free reading.
Exactly. and the reference to Keller is Helen Keller. So there are people who can't see what you write and can't hear what you say, but somehow can interpret words that have never left your lips.
Yes.
And this happens all the time. And I think Byron Donalds is just the latest victim. But this is the left native tongue is Lyonese, and this is what they do. They take one clip, and then they will put words in your mouth that you didn't say, and then they will try to spend the rest of the time bashing you, because most people don't read past the headline.
Right.
And they'll say, "Oh, Byron Donalds says that Jim Crow was good for black folks," and obviously that's an obvious lie.
And I'm glad you brought up the DeSantis thing too, because that curriculum was actually consistent with the AP curriculum in the first place on African American studies, and the concept was that slaves used some of the skills from their enslavement in order to make money for themselves after they were free. Which is an uncontroversial point and historically true. If you go and look at Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery, he explicitly talks about this detail. And he says, in fact, that many black Americans were in a better position to generate some income for themselves than white Americans who now no longer had slaves in the South. In fact, those whites were so helpless, they had no idea how to function without the labor around them anymore, the slaves that they had before. So it's an actual part of history. The left's position is we shouldn't teach it, and then they come along and they suggest that the right is trying to stop you from knowing about history.
Correct. And this is why, for me personally, and I learned this a long time ago, I don't let people who lie with such frequency shame me or lecture me on particularly when it comes to race and history, because, again, these are folks who I've seen, whether it's Al Sharpton or other people, other Democrats, they will talk about not just Jim Crow, James Crow Esquire, Jimmy Crow, Jane Crow, Jim Eagle, and it's always the same point. It is a scare tactic meant to emotionally manipulate black voters into doing or supporting whatever leftist policy is up on deck. And the president did this a couple of years back when Georgia was going to change their voting laws, and he mentioned, and he said, this makes Jim Crow. This is Jim Eagle, right? So this is what they do. Now, what they don't want to do is address the substance of these claims. And again, what Byron Donalds said was absolutely correct. From 1890 through the 1950s, black men and women got married at younger ages and were more likely to be married by the age of 35 than their white counterparts. And the majority, even in 1965, when the Moynihan Report was written and a 1 in 4 out of wedlock birth rate was considered a national emergency, that still tells you that the majority of black children were born to married parents and lived with two married parents. Today, unfortunately, 70% of black children are born out of wedlock and 45% live with a single mother. Now, if somebody wants to say that is a sign of progress because an expansion of government social welfare programs can do what fathers were typically responsible for doing, I would just like them to make that argument flat-footed instead of trying to slam the congressman for something he didn't say.
He also pointed to Great Society initiatives by LBJ and the government's role in all of this. Having looked at this in your career, Delano Squires, how convinced are you that the government has had a massive hand in destroying the black family?
Well, I certainly think it's had a significant hand. Now, I'm the type of person that believes in agency and responsibility. So at times I get uncomfortable with pushing it all off and saying, well, this is all caused by government programs. Because if that's the case, then the natural solution is to say, well, this will all be fixed by government programs. And I do not think that that's the case. But what the government did was create a set of powerful incentives that encourage unwed mothers to not marry the fathers of their children. And it allowed a scenario in which, a woman who didn't have a husband could still be supported financially. Now, instead of, the man who gave her the child, now it was Uncle Sam. And since then, we've been practicing, political polyamory for the last 60 plus years, not just with black women, certainly, but certainly concentrated in some neighborhoods in that particular demographic. So I think the incentive structure in the 1960s that said we want to make it so that a woman does not need a husband in order to provide for her and her children was one of the worst policy decisions ever made in this country. And in fact, the only ethnic group below that Moynihan threshold, right, 25% out of wedlock birth rate today are Asian Americans. Whites are at about 28%, Hispanics are a little over 50%, and as I said, Black Americans are at 70%. So this is a universal problem.
Yes.
And I think it's one that should receive universal attention, particularly as we are coming up on Father's Day.
Yeah, that's critical. All right, let's look at the numbers for all demographics now, because there's a survey out of Pew this week, and they asked how much of a priority should marriage and children be. They asked Americans. Roughly 4 in 10 registered voters say society is better off if people make marriage and having children a priority. That's a minority of respondents, by the way, 40%. Mm-hmm. While a majority say society is just as well off if people have priorities other than family and children. Trump supporters, 59%, are much more likely than Biden supporters at 19% to say that it's better if people prioritize marriage and children. So that's a massive discrepancy. Trump supporters are much more likely to say families are important. Biden supporters, just a fifth of them think that. Why is that?
Well, I think this is, in some respects, a war of worldviews. People often say that politics is downstream from culture, and I think that there's a lot to be said for that. But culture is downstream from worldview, which ultimately means, in many respects, culture is downstream from religion. And as we've become less and less religious, we've gotten further and further away both from the definitions of marriage, right? The design for marriage. People don't even acknowledge that only women can get pregnant anymore. So we have changed significantly as a culture, and I think the sort of deconstructionist model that has accompanied all of the radical movements since the 60s, feminism, particularly with its push for abortion, wanting to sever sex from reproduction, and certainly, the feminists who are anti-marriage wanting to sever women from their homes. That has had an effect, and I think over 6 decades we're starting to see that fruit.
Well, one of the effects is it affects how long your view is, right, on the country. So if you have children or grandchildren, you have to take the long view. You think to yourself, what can I do to ensure that the country is good for them, that I can hand them something better than I had? But if your view is that children need to be excluded from your life, that they're an inconvenience, that they shouldn't be a priority, well, you're living for the now. You have very little incentive to care that much about the future.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've started to write about and speak about more is the fact that the sort of Andrew Tate style alpha male Chad influencer online is really a mirror image of the pink-haired gender studies radical feminists on the left, because both of them say the same thing. They say marriage and children are a bad deal. They say, put all of your energy into your own educational and economic pursuits. They say consume everything you have now and in this generation. And to me, both of them push an anti-family and anti-marriage and anti-natalist position. And I think this is why both conservatives and moderate, sane liberals need to be able to push back on that and say, no, like we want to be able to hand off prosperity to our posterity. And people who say that children and marriage are not high priorities will never be able to do that. And it is a frustration, even going back to the Byron Donalds conversation, particularly around the Black family. So many of the people who spend, significant amount of time talking about generational wealth and how, the Black community needs to generate and pass on generational wealth, support politics that destroy future generations.
Exactly.
Right. So you can't, on one hand, talk about building generational wealth when you're not building families, and you're certainly not building intact families, and or when you're pushing abortion at every turn. And this is what the left does, particularly as it relates to the Black community.
Such a smart point, and another huge incoherent claim by the left. Delano Squires, thank you very much, as always. I always am grateful for our conversations. I learn a lot, so thank you very much. Good to talk to you today, sir.